Hey, Skanda. What's
Hey,
going on?
a lot.
Light here. I know, right? Let's wait for people to join us here. Thanks for making time. As our viewers will know, Skanda is our director of research and our guru on all things macro, law, Fed. And we are talking the day after, today's November 25th. We're talking the day after Secretary Mnuchin said that he wanted not only to take unused CARES Act funds back from the Fed, but also deposit them in the Treasury's general fund, which I gather he says will support deficit reduction. In other words, the funds will not be repurposed for other uses.
Just to be clear, he's also saying that to use these funds again requires a new congressional appropriation, that it requires new law in order to be able to use these funds for any other purpose other than paying the Treasury debts.
So you have a tweet thread that's gotten a lot of attention, but let's break this down. I mean, where should we start? Because it seems like there's several different pieces.
Yes.
There's the pot of money.
Mm-hmm.
There's returning the pot of money. And then there's which account the money gets returned to. Mm-hmm. And then there's, can it be used again?
Yes. I think let's start with just what Mnuchin it's not clear about the timing about what has actually been transferred. I'd be curious to get full clarity on what part has been transferred. My sense is, especially for Fed facilities, the Fed funds have not fully gone back to the general fund yet. Although that is kind of what is...
We don't know whether the Fed has transferred back, but we don't think they have transferred back yet.
That's my sense, especially because some of these facilities are still open and are supposed to be open. So to the extent that there were potentially any people who wanted any institutions that wanted to access the municipal liquidity facility or the Main Street lending program, I think it would be I think that the timing for when those funds get transferred over may be staggered. So I'm not totally clear on that. I think I would like to get full clarity. But Mnuchin has announced that he wants to transfer all of the funds, both those that were, and we'll give more context here, those that were at the Treasury in the Exchange Stabilization Fund, and those funds that were invested in or were pledged to be invested in the Fed's special purpose vehicles, which are the ways in which the Fed does the lending, right? So the Fed creates a corporation that is responsible for doing the actual lending to businesses, municipalities. And what the Treasury did was make an equity investment in that corporation, right? So not all of that has been directly invested. Some of it was pledged to be invested, but not really used. And what Mnuchin is saying is, I want the money back. And not only do I want the money back in the Exchange Stabilization Fund, which is sort of its own, think of it as its own entity. He wants to move it back to the general fund and say, no take-backsies, you can't use this again unless you get Congress approval. That is what Mnuchin is trying to perpetuate that view. And I think that runs afoul of a lot of what the CARES Act actually says.
Can you say more about Exchange Stabilization Fund? People might not be familiar.
So the Exchange Stabilization Fund has pretty broad powers generally. And the Exchange Stabilization Fund is its own it's sort of derisively called the slush fund or bailout fund by its critics. It was used in the Asian financial crisis. It was used in the global financial crisis too. But so Secretaries Paulson, Rubin, Larry Summers, they've all used it and sort of maximize the discretion. And so it tends to sort of get the ire of people who are sort of skeptical of how that discretion gets used. But it's supposed to be, you could technically use it to lend to foreign entities, buy foreign currency. It was supposed to be used for stabilizing exchange rates, but it's also been used for things like guaranteeing money market fund liabilities, right? So it sort of gets stretched to, well, this thing technically has an effect on the dollar, and so therefore it's valid, right? So there are ways in which it's stretched. It's its own account the Treasury has control over.
And a lot of agency, a lot of discretion.
Mm-hmm. In general, it has a lot of flexibility.
Yeah.
One thing to clarify about the CARES Act, which made when we talk about this pot of money, $454, $500 billion, those numbers get thrown around a lot. is that that was appropriation from Congress to the Exchange Stabilization Fund. But it came with a lot of narrower set of purposes of what those funds could be used for. If you remember back in March, the first CARES Act bill that Congress tried to pass failed. And part of the reason it failed was there was worry that there were still sort of leaky gaps in terms of how the Treasury might end up getting more discretion because of how it was drafted than Congress otherwise wanted the Treasury to have. I would say largely driven by a mistrust of Treasury.
Right.
And so there were very clear purposes. And so 4027A is actually a good place to start in the CARES Act, where it says, notwithstanding everything else that most existing law on the Exchange Stabilization Fund, the $500 billion is to be for the specific purpose of carrying out the subtitle, carrying out the part of the CARES Act that relates to this appropriation. So you have a specific set of use cases, so a specific set of ways in which you can spend the money. You can't just go and lend to a foreign entity just because we're giving you $500 billion. You are not given that broad discretion that the Exchange Stabilization Fund is normally given. It's actually something very specific. And so you have to look in the subtitle to ask yourself what parts of this part of the CARES Act, like what are the purposes? And so what actions are actually consistent with that? So I'll go forward one step here. It's like the CARES Act gives Treasury, the Secretary of Treasury, certain authorities that from let's call it March 2020 to December 31st, 2020. And that's all about, there's probably that 500 billion was split up a few different ways. There is the lending to airlines that the Treasury controls. There is cargo air carriers. There's national security that's specified. And then that was supposed to be about $46 billion maximum. And anything left over from that, plus 454, was to be allocated towards Fed facilities. It's very specific that those Fed facilities are meant for, facilities that are meant for providing liquidity to the financial system in order to extend credit to businesses, municipalities, and so just try to make sure it's the real economy. That is the, you can read 4003A and 4003B, makes this very clear. And so what the Treasury has the power to do in coordination with the Fed is to make loans, loan guarantees, or other investments in Fed lending programs and facilities. That's the language around there.
And when Mnuchin, maybe I'm skipping ahead, so feel free to ignore this, but when Mnuchin says, and Toomey says there's a sunset December 31st, 2020, and we talked about this a little bit with Peter Conti Brown earlier in the week, or maybe that was last week. They're talking about there's a sunset around new Treasury money being deployed December 31st. Is that right? But it's not a sunset of the facilities. It's a sunset of, on January 1st, the Treasury can't put up new funds for a new, no. Okay, correct.
So let's be very precise here, right? Because here this is what 4027 and 4029 are about of the CARES Act. I'm just listing the sections in case you want to go back and check. It says no new loans, no new loan loan guarantees, and other investments. When you see it in sort of coupled with subsection B of 4029, it's pretty clear. It's saying new loans, new loan guarantees, and new other investments. That is what does not, that's not allowed. Now, the Treasury will have on January 1st, 2021, certain equity investments in Fed SPVs outstanding. That's the investment. And now there is authority which is clarified in both section 4027 and 4029 about what the Treasury can do on Jan 1st, 2021 by the law of the CARES Act itself, right? Which is they still have the ability to do three things, two of which are not very applicable. So I'm not going to get into them. You can see it on 4027 C1B and C1C. But C1A is the most important one, which is you have the ability to modify, restructure, or otherwise amend your loans, loan guarantees, and other investments outstanding.
Modify, restructure,
structure, or otherwise amend, right? Otherwise amend's pretty broad,
yeah.
but also so is restructuring.
Yeah.
Restructuring is encompassed in terms of in sort of capital markets and rather in terms of how financing and the sort of legal definitions of what restructuring encompasses. This typically also involves capital injections, sort of reallocating what do shareholders own, what do creditors own. So restructuring encompasses quite a bit, but it would have to be for investments outstanding. And the question is about the investments outstanding that will exist on January 1st, 2021, unless they somehow liquidate all these investments, which I think is just not really, again, these things have to be sort of tailored to the purpose of the CARES Act. And so that sort of action would just go against what you were trying to do, which was to provide support to municipalities, provide support to Main Street businesses. So from that standpoint, there will be equity investments that are still there in, I think, all of the SPVs that the Fed created that were supposed to be these vehicles for making investments in particular parts of the economy through facilitating lending primarily. So what the Fed was doing was using the Treasury's equity injection. So the Treasury is the shareholder. And using that as their backstop, the sort of loss absorbing part of the balance sheet to make new loans. And now the Fed's power to make new loans, there's nothing in the CARES Act that talks about that. In the previous live stream, we did with Peter Conti Brown. It's like the Fed, there's nothing that curtails the Fed's ability to make any new loans. Now, just to be clear, there are sunset provisions on the terms of the facility that can be changed purely by the Treasury Secretary and the Fed chair. That, like the municipal liquidity facility, the structure will still exist. It is not after December 31st, 2020. It's not going to make any new purchases until it is re-upped. That is not about that's not about the CARES Act. That's just about Treasury and the Fed agreed to these terms as of now. So that's just a term of the facility. And that's not just we don't get these things. Let's not get these things confused. That term of the facility can be changed by the Treasury Secretary as it is. Yeah. What Pat Toomey is trying to claim, and what Steve Mnuchin is trying to claim, is I know congressional intent, and this is actually all of the authority goes away on Jan 1, 2021, which the law in Section 4027 is very clear that the Treasury Secretary retains certain specific authorities that extend beyond December 31st, 2020, that go into 2021, and do not actually involve shifting the money to the general fund. And the general fund is where what Steve Mnuchin is saying, once I've moved it to the general fund, you got to ask for the authority back. But that is not actually in keeping with the purposes of carrying out the subtitle, right? So I think that's the real problem here, which is there was the purpose of actually using this money for deficit reduction by shifting it to the general fund is only sanctioned on January 1st, 2026. That's the part of it. Yeah, go ahead.
That's what I thought was, I don't know if we've released your memo yet publicly. You're and our colleague Arnab, but that was the two most compelling points. Toomey says it's congressional intent that these sunset, and yet, as you point out, there's a very clear statement in the CARES Act that says, on January 2026, then fund. So why would you put that in if you intended everything to sunset in this December 31st? And then, as you say, the Treasury also has authorities going forward. Why would you have that in there if
you need to go back
if all the facilities have to close shop on December 31st? It doesn't make sense.
Yeah, there's definitely an element, and I think I mean it's pretty clearly working the refs on some level that is like I have to think that Toomey is aware of what is actually in like 4027C1, which says on Jan 1st, 2021, the Treasury Secretary still has all these authorities. And those authorities do not include deficit reduction, shifting to the general fund. that is specifically in 4027C2. And just to be clear, it says on January 1st, 2026. It doesn't say by January 1st, 2026. It doesn't say no later than January 1st, 2026. There's a very clear way to sort of draft this if this was the intent.
Yeah, and it's kind of puzzling because he could make a substantive argument that you could sort of say is stronger, which is, the Fed took a narrow view of what these facilities were for: market backstop, market functioning, prevent credit spreads from blowing out. And on those terms that the Fed set, they have been successful. So substantively, whatever the legalities are, substantively, I want a Treasury Secretary and a Fed chair who wind these up. But he's instead sort of trying to speak his, legal.
He's talking his book.
Yeah, thing into existence and sort of tried to hoodwink reporters and others, and anyway, which seems like the less powerful argument to me. But what do I know? I don't know. Maybe it'll work.
I mean, I think there's two really important things to point out here now in terms of functionally. One is transfer to the general fund is illegal. I think that's like there is no authority before January 1st, 2026. There's no actual there's nothing specified in that subtitle that says you can do this. There are a lot of other things that Steve Mnuchin could do. You could actually invest in some of these lending programs. He could tweak the terms. He's given a lot of authority, but the authority is in very specified purposes to provide liquidity to the financial system, to extend credit. I think he would be well within his rights to bring the money back to the ESF because he thinks maybe there's a new program, or I just want to keep it there because I don't actually think that these Fed facilities are working. There's like a level of policy discretion that I think is totally fine. The notion that he can raid the ESF and put it back in before the next Treasury Secretary comes in is in contravention. And again, here, I think he's effectively doing something illegal to try to have some sort of legally binding effect on the next administration. Is that there are internal remedies to sort of make sure that, like, if he makes this transfer, there's a way to actually, there's a process that Treasury has for actually looking into this. So what exactly was the justification? Is this actually a correct reading of the statute? And so I think that's something that should be investigated. I think it is something that there is going to be recourse available. So I think the other thing that I think is a little bit concerning is, like, there is a certain, like, the Fed's obviously sensitive to its independence. They don't want to be seen as politically partisan. I think it's kind of poisoning the well here in a way that I think is really dangerous. Like, especially with Pat Toomey kind of coming up with this interpretation and sort of trying to, and like, it's so removed from the, like, we look at what Congress actually agreed to. Like, let's look at what actually was in the CARES Act first. Let's try to, like, come with, like, something. I think it leads to more bad faith. It's more institutional erosion if, like, if like senators are just going to make up stuff that's not in the actual statute and claim I knew what the Congress meant even though it's not there. This is actually something that the conservative judicial movement or legal movement was pretty critical of. So it's funny to see it now. Is like I'm making up this stuff and I know what and Mnuchin was in the negotiation, so I knew what it meant. That's usually a red flag, I would say.
Right. Yeah, interesting. What should Joe Biden do? What should Janet Yellen do? What should Jay Powell do?
So
assuming they accept your sort of.
I think that Jay Powell, I want to be like, I understand that he's probably in a tough spot where there are the heat is on him from Senate. He wants to have good relations with Congress and he wants to have good relations with the White House, and now he's being forced to pick and choose, and that's a very tough spot. But it is still the case that the law is the law on some of this stuff, and it is important that he is cognizant of the limits here. Now, in terms of when these funds get transferred over, it's not clear he can just say this is where I want them to be. He could say this is where I want them to be, but like ultimately it's up to the Treasury. Once it's their Treasury, you can do whatever the heck it wants, but then ultimately Treasury can do whatever the heck it wants. I'm saying it legally or illegally, and then it's up to like our institutional ability to like keep that constrained. But that is I think he should be clear about where this is. Transferring it back to the ESF is perfectly okay. Transferring it for another purpose that's not specified in the CARES Act is not. I think that is like one place where it should be I think that clarity is important because otherwise he is effectively being complicit in this. I think it's sort of like that is the appearance he's giving. And I think it ultimately leads to a notion that the Fed is actually playing partisan games on behalf of Steve Mnuchin. I think it's a tough spot. I get it, but it's also like, it's not just like, I think that is the part where like working the refs here is pretty dangerous as far as what Pat Toomey is doing here. And I find that to be really concerning. I think as far as what Joe Biden and Janet Yellen, like, I think first is like institutions matter. When we in terms of pass a law, it gave specific purposes, and to go against them is something that like they should be trying to stamp out. I don't think that's something that I think both of them are institutionalists. I understand in some ways this might seem like this is not a question of, oh, like we found something that like some loophole or something like that to the CARES Act. I think it's like there are clear authorities that were made available in January 1st, 2021. It gives a Treasury Secretary the ability not to make new investments in new SPVs. That's true. But there are investments outstanding.
No investments in new SPVs, but potential investments in a restructured municipal.
Yeah, they can restructure their investments in existing Fed facilities that have Treasury capital behind them. They do have the authority to modify the terms. Those are still available. They can't, if the Fed decided they wanted to make a new facility to address some other pocket of businesses or municipalities, and if like then I think Treasury would be constrained.
But they might have they still might have other funds in the ESF, so it's not like they couldn't use any ESF funds. But
I'm specifically talking about the $500 million that Congress appropriated through the CARES Act. That still remains available for a specific set of purposes, and on Jan 1, 2026, these funds need to the remaining funds have to go that effectively that goes away. So I think that's what's at stake here. I think, to be honest, it seems very, if I'm just sort of reading the tea leaves, Pat Toomey knows this is what this authority exists. I think he wouldn't be harping on this so much if you read his reaction to Janet Yellen's announcement of the two that's going to be nominated for Treasury Secretary. The first question she got asked was about whether that he's like going to ask her about is sort of this authority. I think he kind of knows that it has there is a certain like lane in which the Treasury Secretary can still operate, and I think it might look, obviously, I do ask myself the question, would this be such a big sticking point for Mnuchin and maybe even for Toomey? Maybe not. But I think he also just doesn't want any of this sort of policy discretion with the Fed or the Treasury beyond a certain point. I think that I'll say, I think it may be more sincere, but I think for Secretary Mnuchin, I'm not sure he would have done this if Trump won, right? He could have made this clear in October, but he didn't. So I think there is some bad faith here.
Yeah, and people pointed that out, that none of this was in his letters pre-election. My mentions are a mess because I tweeted something about Janet Yellen that's going viral. So I don't know if anyone actually has any questions for us, but I know you have to jump off soon. What I don't know, what else should we say? So Janet Yellen will come in.
If she gets confirmed, right? There's a huge set of things where this could all change, right? One is they could pass a bill that actually changes the authority.
Right.
This could be part of the deal. So that's one place. Then there is what happens with the Georgia runoffs. That determines who's chair of Senate Banking Committee, who's actually able to, who controls the Senate confirmation process. Then there's the third step, which is what happens with the confirmation hearings with Janet.
What commitments does she make?
What commitments does she make? What kinds of things do they? I suspect that some Republicans think that they can premise this on. So as I said, I think there's some really it is really a red flag that they're doing this in terms of what the bill says and then what Treasury is doing. And I said there are internal remedies available to the next Treasury Secretary to investigate this and sort of make sure that the law is ultimately followed. But yeah, I think that's a real concern, and I think that it would be really wise for those who see what the stakes are. And this, by the way, I just want to also make this last point clear. 13.3 lending does not require this. It does not require that the Treasury have to give equity capital.
Yeah.
It is more like institutional grease. It's more like a way to grease the wheels of making sure that the Fed feels like it has appropriate political cover. And that might be wise on some level in terms of making sure that it's like, the more we can do this stuff as like Congress and the White House agreeing, it makes things easier, as opposed to having agencies kind of do their own work. But it doesn't mean the discretion doesn't exist. And just because we can't come to perfect agreement, because that seems like the only thing times we can do that are in deep crisis, and even then it seems like it's not always that great. These authorities still exist. There's 454 or 500 billion, however you want to think about it. It's not a necessary condition for a new Fed lending. 13.3. 13.3 just requires Treasury to approve of the Fed's actions. It doesn't require the Treasury to put money in. That's not in 13.3 at all. So the 13.3 of the Federal Reserve Act, which is what gives the Fed like a lot of its authorities here to actually lend beyond just to banks and to financial institutions.
Excellent. What's the next shoe to drop? I mean, if there are any reporters or others who are watching this, like what should they be on the lookout for? Like, is it Powell's the actual transfer back, or is it what Yellen says about her interpretation of this, or what's
I suspect that you may not hear directly from Yellen. Or not. I still want to call her Chair Yellen. So I think that's I don't think that she will say anything. I think it would be probably wise for her to be a little bit patient here in terms of what Mnuchin is actually going to do. But I think there's a December 1st hearing, and that's going to be
December 1st hearing.
That there are hearings next week for both House and Senate actually, that are worth paying attention to. I think you will see this come up and should come up if, especially from the standpoint that Congress's job is also about oversight. And right now it looks like there's a lot here that is really questionable in terms of what they're doing, both in terms of violating the CARES Act and the intent behind it. I think that's something that Stephen Mnuchin should be on notice for.
So in the next week, is Mnuchin and Powell testifying, or just Powell?
Yes. Mnuchin, I think both are testifying. Yes.
Oh, great.
So,
all right. So
I think they're
fireworks
testifying together.
Fireworks next week. Thanks, Ganda. This is helpful.
Great. Hopefully it's helpful to our audience.
It is. And thank you to Kim for helping, as always.
Thank you, Kim.
Setting this up. And we'll be back after. Awesome.